This is the Storyworks Roundtable, where we have conversations about craft, because becoming a successful author begins with writing a great story. Hello, and welcome to this week's Storyworks Fiction. Today, Kathryn, Robert, and I are talking about writing dystopian fiction when you're living or feel like you're living in a dystopian world. Can you do it? Can you face it? Is there an audience for it? What does it mean? What is dystopia these days anyway?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Living during a pandemic and seeing people quote on social media, Orwell was writing about this, and it's very easy to pull in all these examples and twist some of the facts to make it look as if there's, some crazy stuff going on, and maybe there is, maybe there isn't, and maybe there always has been. It's just a little bit more transparent now. But you do wonder, if I were to pen a dystopian work of fiction where the entire human race was being slowly wiped out by a viral escape, would it be of any interest to anyone? so
everyone would say, "Oh, we lived that. Not again."
I think it's that there's always something worse, right?
Yeah,
I think there's that appeal of wanting to see people live through the worst and make it out on the other side, quote unquote, intact, whatever that means, mentally, physically, I don't know. But I think it's that perseverance of the human spirit through what can be seen as the worst of society or the worst of the world. And I think that's the appeal of dystopian fiction, right? Is that living through the worst case scenario and making yourself feel like, you know what? I can handle whatever is going on in my personal life right now, because at least it's not a zombie apocalypse, or at least it's not a tidal wave that took half of the United States away. There's all of that kind of, at least it's not, that can downgrade our current situation into something a little more manageable. I think that's where the escape comes from.
There's that, and there's also the living vicariously through the protagonist piece. So if you're feeling like the world has gone to heck in a handbasket and you are helpless to change it, but you can look at this, read this novel, and the hero is, kicking butt left and right, that can be its own kind of uplift to your spirits and to your sense of self and of agency. Just cheering on the character, albeit a fictional person who's doing something, whether from a place of heroism or a place of desperation, a place of necessity. At the end, that hero is going to triumph. And because we are assured of that when we open a novel, granted, not every novel, but when we're turning to fiction for escapism, that's the assurance we want, that our hero will triumph.
I think that's really good point about the fact that it's really essentially at heart a survivor story. So we're effectively putting forward arguments for hope and courage for people who have survivor anxiety in a time where they feel like they're living in great fear. So you could make an argument that, say, in our current 2021 scenario, there's even more of an argument for good dystopian fiction that provides hope. There's a wonderful nonfiction book called The Rational Optimist, and I always recommend it for people who become very darkly fatalistic about the human capacity to create its own extinction event, or that Big Brother is leaning in too hard. And it's a wonderful history of extreme situations humanity has faced and come out the other side, right up to modern day, so nuclear threats, cold wars, world wars, pandemics, extreme survival events, and we've come through. And so if you take that kind of global sense of humanity and then distill it down into dystopian fiction, that's probably the kernel of it, isn't it? As you said, it's that, attach myself to somebody who, no matter what, this has gotten really bad, but humans, we can do it. Doesn't matter how dark it is. Everybody else, I'm the only person left on the planet, but heck.
Well, and we kind of started this whole like idea generation with the idea, like, can you write dystopian fiction in this world, right?
Yeah.
And I just saw the teaser trailer. I had to look it up for Netflix is doing it. I think it's a comedy. It looks like a comedy called Don't Look Up, right? About a comet hitting the Earth or an asteroid hitting the Earth. Don't quote me on that. And like literally in the teaser trailer, they're in the Oval Office and their president's like, you don't understand how many times the world's been ending in the last year. Ha, ha, ha. Right. But like, there's that idea that like, even in the midst of all of this, we still want to have that experience. And this is a comedic version of a dystopic thing that's happening. Right. Or I'm trying to think of the other ones that I've seen, like The Last Man on FX right now is happening, like all the men have died. Right. And that's just the premise. Right. But it's still in our, atmosphere happening all around us in media in various forms. So yes, the answer is please write the dystopic fiction.
Especially if you make us laugh, right?
Yes.
Yeah. We all need a good chuckle these days.
Yeah.
But I think this is the human condition, is to be able to catastrophize, isn't it? It's something that, we can take even just a simple, social media post and it sends us down the spiral of, oh my God, we are absolutely doomed. And then, you're out at the park and you see some chuckling kids and, all of a sudden life is good again. And it's important, I think, to, in these times, to find those moments. And maybe escaping into dystopian fiction allows us to, as you say, Kathryn, to come back and go, well, it's in actual fact, what I've got is pretty good.
Right. And like, Alida, you said that it was all about like that character and the protagonist's journey. And I'm thinking about dystopian fiction that I've read. It's usually you attach so hard to not only a character, but a group of really tight band of characters, right? And you get that kind of like that brotherhood feeling and that unification thing that happens between characters. And I think in dystopian fiction, it's so important to give us that character bond with the reader, right? And that's the power there of that fiction.
The best storytellers move their readers, whether to laughter, tears, or some other point on the spectrum of human emotion. In order to write emotionally evocative, sensory-rich, compelling narratives, we must mine our wellspring of personal experiences using the storyteller's first set of tools, our memory, emotion, and body. In this generative workshop, we'll meet over Zoom to explore our own first tools in a safe, small group. Whether you want to have readers in stitches over the best rom-com in print or get them weeping over your tragic heroine's epic fate, you'll come away with the know-how to transform your critical story moments into powerfully memorable scenes. This is a generative workshop, great for fiction writers and memoir writers equally. This workshop begins in October. Head over to storyworksfiction.com to get all the details and sign up today.
Yeah, there's some great optimism in that as well, because you often find that tight little band are usually really often tropes, the different people. You might have the wealthy or the privileged, then you've got the poor, or you've got the struggling family, or you've got the wounded, or this person who's really, really sick. And the only way they can survive is to all collaborate and cooperate and work on their differences. And, if there's a kernel of hope for humanity in there, that's exactly what we need right now. We really need to come together.
Yeah.
Right.
Raya and the Last Dragon.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. I think another aspect of this type of fiction that we should talk about is writing about a thing without writing about it. In our last episode, we were talking about historical, the way fiction has changed historically over history, not historical fiction, the genre. And afterwards, I mentioned hearing or reading something about the Russians, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, et al., that they could not write social and political commentary because of the world they lived in. So they had to write ordinary stories about ordinary people doing ordinary things. But within those tales, there was social and political commentary, but it was subtext. It was delivered through this narrative that made the message part and parcel of the narrative, but outwardly invisible. And so when we write non-contemporary fiction, whether that's historical or science fiction or fantasy or dystopian fantasy, it's because we want to explore something that is removed from what we're currently living. But what do we want to explore other than the human experience? It always comes back to what we are living. So if we were going to write dystopian fiction today, given what we're living in, what might that look like? Where do you go from here? Have you thought about this at all?
Yeah. I think, for example, you could write it in a very confined sense. So, we could have people trapped in a cave in an avalanche, for example, and the dystopia could be the survival of that and the conflict between the people there. So, and within that is the embedded metaphor of, say, the current pandemic and the divisive nature of the different beliefs across the way that people and governments accordingly are treating it. No matter what you believe, we all know that if you go onto social media and post a particular point of view, it's not going to be very long before the other point of view comes in. So you may not want to write a book that's as overt as that. Mm-hmm. But I think, as what you were saying, Alida, is that you can be, if you're careful with your subtext and embedding the metaphors and making it metaphorically the same structure. What did we used to call that I think they were structural metaphors. I think what you do is you take your story premise and outline in an overt sense, and then say, what can I flip that into? What is that also the structure for? And then it could be an intimate story of a family, or it could be a huge story of a corporation. But the sense of the metaphor that you're using there is the same vehicle. I'm speaking very abstractly, I know, but it's
well, so Orwell's Animal Farm, not 1984, but right. Animal Farm comes to mind, where you have a very clear social and political commentary, but you're placing it into this sort of parable with talking animals on the farm and the overthrow of the farmer and the way the animals' narrative of their own history changes with the political movements of the farm, of the evolution that the animals carry forward. And so that is that sort of an appropriate reference point to what you're saying, Robert?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, that's one that's, he wore it on his sleeve with that one.
He did.
No question. But I think you can do exactly what Orwell did there and be extraordinarily subtle, so that on one level it's a story about a fractured family, but on another level it's about humanity dealing with a massive crisis. Mm-hmm. So I think that's where extraordinary literature comes from, frankly. We can joke about dystopian fiction as being, it's another zombie attack, but actually it can be some of the most delicately observed, interesting reflections on how humans cope with catastrophes.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and the beauty of fiction and these stories is that we're really allowing people to deep dive into another's experience, right? So
Right.
rather than just seeing the surface level, which we get with the people around us all the time, we get to let them get the backstory. And we've talked about this in multiple episodes before, getting that motivation so your reader has buy-in, right? So they know why this character is having a reaction that they're having, right? And so you get to have this experience that you can turn metaphorical about something that's going on, where the reader actually gets the whole of it, right? Rather than just seeing that reaction point, they get the entire history that leads up to that reaction point, which I think is missing in a lot of current just news and narrative that we see pouring in around us, right? We don't have the context. Stories allow you to explore that context, which I think is so important. And the dystopian idea there is taking that disaster, then taking it to an intimate level, and then allowing you to have the full context for the story. So you get multiple angles, right, in order to understand and explore everything that's going on, rather than just a one-sided narrative.
Right. And going back to that point about all fiction is about exploring what it means to be human, when you are writing your story or reading a story, you have the opportunity to explore multiple avenues into an issue instead of just the one that you believe or the one you experience or are confronted with every day. And so, you might know that the guy down the street makes a choice you disagree with, but that doesn't mean you know his story and his motivation and his reasoning and his past experience that's influencing that choice. But if you read a book about that guy down the street making that choice, then you get that experience, and that creates empathy and understanding and exploration, which can lead to discourse, even if it's only an internal discourse between yourself and the story. But that's so valuable in opening up our perspectives and our minds to what's going on around us, using our fiction as a vehicle for understanding, even when it's metaphorical, even when it's a parable, even, when it's seemingly dislike our own lives.
Yeah, it's a vehicle for hope, I suppose, really. When I was thinking, listening to both of you talk there, that you're talking about the characters' motivations. One of the interesting things about dystopian fiction is that you're specifically robbing a character of previous goals that they may have had. And that's pretty close to home at the moment for a lot of us. There are people who can't leave their home. There are people who can't travel. There are people who are frightened for whatever reason. And I think dystopian fiction addresses a lot of that, because you are positioning a character whose previous ambitions and goals and have now been, it's been pulled out from underneath their feet. What do you do? What do you do when all your norms are thrown up in the air? And so, yes, okay, so you can say, well, we're facing some of that now, but that doesn't mean that, it probably means that you don't write a word for word, this is what happens when there's a global pandemic and, and people get fractured and blah, blah, blah. Maybe that's not as endearing, but there's still reasons for us to read fiction that is scary or daunting or fearful, and showing how humans confront that, and in the face of being robbed of everything that they thought they had available as choice, still managed to prevail.
Right.
Yeah, and I like what you just said about not writing word for word. We get enough of what's happening shoved down our throats every single day through all of our devices and all of our media outlets, and every conversation we enter, it seems, turns to news of the day. So it's important, even if we're exploring the issues of the day, to come at them through a different world or through a different perspective. And so that's where the dystopian part of dystopian fiction becomes so useful to us. How can we explore real tragedy, real upheaval, we can make it more palatable or more sympathetic or more interesting or less frightening, or, it can be frightening, but frightening in a way that isn't what we face outside our window. So in that sense, less frightening. And that is a great tool that fiction writers have that journalists don't have, that essayists don't have.
Yeah, you made a good point before off air about being careful not to be tasteless, and so therefore, if you write extremely topical fiction, then you've got to be careful that we don't rub salt into the wound. There are millions of lives have been lost, so there's, if you're going to write about a viral pandemic, then be careful. So I think what we would want to do is use our human suffering as inspiration. This is a time when art is meant to prevail. Actually, it's one of the things that often comes through in times of great stress.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great point. I was just thinking about I Am Legend. That story has come to mind a few times as we've been talking. And it does open with a viral pandemic, but that's in the backstory. When it opens, that has already happened. And then everyone except our protagonist has been turned into some kind of vampiric monster, which, I don't know if I have anything great to say about it, but it just keeps coming to mind. And I was kind of stuck on that thought, as a way to explore humanity. And it looks at evolution as well. At the end, the question is, who's the real monster here? Is it our protagonist? Or is it the people who survived the pandemic and were transformed as a result, who evolved as a result? I don't know where I'm going with it. One of you needs to pick it up here. that story just kept coming to mind.
And it came to mind because it made you think. And it made you think about the reality, your own reality maybe, but also the reality that was presented in a different way than maybe you were expecting. It made you engage with it, which I think great dystopian fiction makes you do. It makes you think about the trajectory of your life. It makes you think about the trajectory of the world, and it just engage with it. It doesn't have to be scary or overwhelming or anxiety making so much as it just makes you engage and take a minute to think about what is happening, even if it's just thinking about what was happening in the book. Right. And I think dystopian fiction, just for pleasure's sake, is maybe a little bit not so much anymore, but where it makes you think and engage and really take a second, I think is important.
Yeah, well said. And I think, one of the things that really sticks with me about that story is that the question of moral high ground is raised, because throughout our hero's journey, he's right, they must be destroyed, they must be vanquished. And then at the very end, that's turned on its head. And the hero, maybe the hero was wrong. Maybe the hero was the villain. Maybe the hero was left behind, and the others are, humanity going forward, which I guess if you haven't read the story, the sort of vampiric monsters who survived the pandemic, there is a faction of them that are no longer monsters. They still have this vampiric alteration to them, but they've evolved and they have conscience and they have intellect and they have society and such. And so then the hero of the story is the last vestige of old humanity. So the story ends with us not having that sense of elation of being the survivor, but really questioning right and wrong and where we stand as readers in relation to that story.
Nice.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, what occurred to me then as you were talking that through is that empathy is a huge part of, well, it's a big part of obviously any fiction. You want to find a way to attach your reader, which is, I suppose, what we've been talking about before, to the main character. But in this particular case, maybe one of the reasons we're attracted to dystopian fiction is that because we can empathize with somebody because they're in a situation where it seems like everything's going wrong or has already gone wrong, and it's now a different world. And that touches on some experiences that we have in our current world. But what it does is, through that empathy, allows us to understand, well, how would I make choices if those things were presented to me? I wouldn't do what this main character did, or I would do what they did. And I'm not saying it should be education. I'm just saying that it is, I think, as Kathryn says, it makes you think. And, if there's something that we need a lot in this world at the moment, it's being thoughtful and being empathic. So you could argue that there's a huge case for some really spectacularly good dystopian fiction.
Yes, there is. If you're only on audio, there's a baby on the screen right now, so excuse me. Which is great because it makes me smile. So perfect.
Right.
Yes.
And this is the thing, isn't it? When you see little ones and you think, wow, they deserve a better world.
Yes.
And so if there's one reason for writing dystopian fiction is to show how we might come out the other end,
Yeah. And, to go back to one of your opening comments, Robert, we need to go read our dystopian novels in a park while children are laughing nearby.
Yes.
So we can get through the hard parts.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Any other thoughts on writing dystopian fiction while living in a seemingly dystopian world?
Yeah, it's fodder for the imagination.
It is. Yeah, definitely. And if we wanted to recap, hope, survival, empathy, sometimes humor, and making people think, I think those are really, key points to take away from the conversation.
We kind of entered this thinking, oh, maybe you don't want to write dystopian fiction in the middle of this. And I think coming out of this, I'm thinking, maybe I do.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Thank you for listening to the Storyworks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com. I can't talk about dystopian fiction with the baby on the screen.